U.S. President Donald Trump fled the G7 summit Monday after being scolded by other world leaders, including Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, for his aggressive trade and tariff policies and his backsliding on climate policy. Trump used the Israel-Iran war as an excuse, but he was visibly irritated by his treatment at the hands of the other G7 members. Still, UBC political scientist Stewart Prest says that the meeting went about as well as it could have for Canada. Welcome to the interview, Stewart.
And my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Eventful day at the G7 summit yesterday in Kananaskis, Alberta. Lots of pushback from the other leaders against Donald Trump's protectionism and trade tariffs and so on. How did this all go down?
Well, it seems like there was tension in the air before even the meeting began, and in the run-up to the actual meeting in Kananaskis, we saw the non-American leaders, if you like, taking a number of positions to try to indicate effectively an anti-American stance on things like territorial expansion to Greenland, to the tariff regime that President Trump continues to maintain. So we did see a lot of maneuvering even prior to the day's meeting, and then it was a day full of bilateral conversations and not really any kind of consensus emerging out of those conversations. The United States and the UK have an intention to complete a trade deal, it seems like. But beyond that, we had this continuing background of tension that then crystallized in Donald Trump leaving the meeting early.
Yeah, let's talk about that because he was kind of in a snit all day. He got some criticism from the other leaders over his trade practice, like, fairly harsh for given the context. And then I guess there are tensions between, the war between Israel and Iran. And he made the excuse was he had to go back to Washington because of that. But really, I think everybody's take on it was that his nose was out of joint for being criticized, and he's notoriously thin-skinned, and he just didn't just want to take it anymore.
Yeah, I think this meeting really was something like an intervention, if you like, by the other Western economies, their leaders, all saying in different ways, in different formats, we need to reopen the world to free trade. It is the backbone of the prosperity of these developed economies and the hope for the rest of the world to progress as well. And the longer that we continue to have this kind of impasse, the more it emboldens states on the margins of civility, if you like. So we got countries like Iran that continue to maintain claims to develop a nuclear deterrent. The more that we have this opposition within the G7, the more it creates opportunities for those kinds of rogue states, and then pretext for states like Israel that are increasingly bellicose to take matters into their own hands as well. So this dissension within among Western developed economies does no one good that we are hoping for effectively.
Let's put some context around this, Stuart, because we've had decades now of what we call multilateralism, where we have institutions and we have trade agreements and other kinds of agreements where we have broad agreement amongst many, many countries, and particularly amongst the developed countries. And now Trump doesn't believe in that. He believes in bilateralism, where the United States will negotiate its own agreements directly with regions or groups like the EU and with Canada. And that is what the other leaders were pushing back on, is that bilateral approach as opposed to the multilateral approach that has worked from their point of view so well for so long.
I think it's a nice way to summarize it. We can put it even more bluntly that the United States after World War II, in cooperation with its allies, principally the United Kingdom and countries like Canada, built a global trade and financial order that was focused on opening up economies to globalize trade in different ways. And it's had a number of effects, and many of them are quite good, increased prosperity around the world. There are other effects as well that we can get into, but on the whole, it has made more countries more prosperous. And the United States was at the heart of that order. And now given that other countries are using that same order to catch up to progress, countries like China, like we saw Europe rebounding after World War II. We have countries in East Asia prospering as well. There's that sense that the United States is no longer as central to this order, and it seems like Trump is in a kind of really base way trying to push back against that and to use American power in these bilateral talks to threaten and cajole and to try to use grievances to get better deals with one country after another. And in so doing, it's tearing up that trust-based relationship that emerged among many countries in the particularly post-Cold War era.
Now, I want to talk about the negotiations over the trade agreement that Canada and the U.S. have been negotiating. There was an early, just shortly after Trump landed, there was a press conference with Prime Minister Mark Carney, and it was very friendly. And Trump said nice things about Carney and about Canada. It sounded like they were going to try to get something done. But then Carney apparently was quite hard on him during the plenary session. And it seems like an odd strategy here, where Carney has been building a relationship with Trump. Our senior officials are negotiating this agreement. Carney talks to Trump on the phone all the time, but then he uses a public forum to kind of, upbraid him over his trade policies. What might that mean for the trade negotiations?
I think Canada is trying to do a couple of things at once. Mark Carney is trying to do a couple of things at once here. And one is to protect Canadian interests in that bilateral relationship. And so there's a lot of energy going into to maintaining a positive vibe with the president and to trying to find ways to address the ever revolving set of demands and concerns and grievances that come out of Washington. And that to some extent is a mug's game. It will never end. And so Canada is just really trying to find ways to insulate itself from the worst of those kinds of outbursts and to rebuild a relationship. And it seems like the approach right now is a comprehensive one, so that Canada will seek to have a binding new agreement that combines economics and security concerns. But at the same time, Canada's trying to deal with, along with its allies at the G7, this greater threat to global trade as a whole. And so Canada can't really give up the line there either and say, well, as long as our bilateral relations or the talks are going on, we don't care about the multilateral side of things. And so Canada is trying to maintain both of those fronts at the same time, but that's a tricky thing to do.
Yeah, the U.S. was also isolated on climate policy, which hasn't been in the news much lately. But the other G7 leaders, including Canada, pushed back really hard on climate policy, and Trump wanted nothing to do with it. And in fact, they wouldn't sign the joint statement, the joint communique at the end of the summit, that sort of thing. And I was a little surprised, to be honest, that the other leaders push back as hard on climate as they did, knowing where Trump is coming from.
Well, again, it's that sense of on the one hand wanting to pick your battles and not to unduly poke the bear, I guess, with Trump. But at the same time, there is, I think, a growing sense, and I think it's right, that you can never fully placate or sufficiently placate the US president such that there will be a clear sailing ahead. There is no clear sailing with this president. If you solve these grievances, there will be new ones. And so to give up on something as important as action on climate change in a vain pursuit of trying to placate the president, it will not work. So you're much better off taking the fights as they come and standing on principle on points that truly matter. And the structure of the global trading regime and action on the changing climate, those are two things that truly do matter and cannot be sacrificed.
What about the spin that Trump put on it for his political base back in the United States? There was talk about him standing up to globalist elites, and that his walking out was evidence of his America First approach to things. I mean, how convenient is that for him? where he has a built-in excuse anytime that he doesn't like the way the conversation is going. He can spin it to his advantage and know that he'll be get a fair amount of support back in the U.S. for it.
Yeah, that's effectively the expected dynamic, and so it would be surprising if he didn't do that. To be honest, he is a populist leader. He has come to power in convincing his supporters that he is the only one really who can speak truth to power to these institutions, and has managed to maintain that story even as president of the United States, which is quite a trick, to be honest. There is no more powerful office, and yet he is able to present himself as confronting the powerful, and so that really brings us back to the longer term battles, which are to maintain democratic accountability around the world, and find ways to support democratic action in the United States, so that he can be held to account, and to continue to find ways to have an open conversation that is based in things like evidence, scientific consensus around things like a changing climate, so that as much as there is an echo chamber within American politics, and we have a version of that here in Canada, there are still ways to have a more open conversation where things like evidence can help people make up their minds, and to see what really matters here. And you're never going to convince everyone. Well, it seems like we're in a world where things are going to be bifurcated. We have different information environments, and we're never going to truly get out of that world. But that's not a reason to give up trying, effectively.
So how do we perceive this G7 summit, Stuart? Was it a failure? Was it a success from Canada's point of view? Because clearly we lined ourselves up with some of the European leaders, and that's been part of Mark Carney's strategy, is to have a deeper relationship both on defense and trade with Europe. What's your take on it?
I think for Canada's perspective, this is about as good as it gets. We have promised to continue to work on border issues with the United States, and so things are not getting actively worse on that front at the moment, and we're holding the line, as it were. And so I think that's about as good as you can hope with this particular White House. And at the same time, Canada is meaningfully strengthening our ties with European allies, and so that gives us some options for economic diversification. But just as importantly, it continues to reinforce the sense of why Canada matters and why Canada continues to exist as it does. And we are no longer actively talking about threats to Canadian sovereignty, but that's not that far behind us. The talk of Canada as the 51st state, and so finding ways to really assert Canada's independence on the world stage will continue to be important as well, and to continue to fight for things like open multilateral trade, a rules-based global order, one in which the conflict resolution remains a primary goal for leading states. So these are all good things, and we saw, in a sense, a failure in that we don't have a joint communique, but it's I think in some ways a good failure where there was not a willingness to sacrifice that which ought not be sacrificed in the name of unity.
Well, Stuart, we're going to continue to watch the American political circus with great interest, particularly as it affects Canada. Thank you very much for this.
Yeah, my pleasure. Anytime.